David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So we need to have just like a very real and honest conversation today about the reality that Donald Trump just always gets his ass kicked internationally by everyone, and I don't like it. And I want to know whether you see it my way and whether this is something you're concerned about. And I'm not talking about any kind of delusional. My framework for this is not some hyper-nationalist. The U.S. needs to always come out, quote, winning at the expense of every other country. I want us working together with the international community. I want to solve serious problems in productive ways as an alliance of countries. But what I mean is, why is it that Donald Trump is always the loser in negotiations, often negotiations he shouldn't be participating in, always the laughingstock, always the guy that the adults in the room often aren't even inviting into the room anymore because his presence is so pointless and counterproductive? That's what I want to talk about today. It is embarrassing that the president can't stop getting his ass kicked day in and day out. It's boneheaded stupidity, and I'm going to give you some examples. There's lots of good ones, by the way, in a recent Daily Kos piece, which I recommend you check out, by Lawrence Lewis, which was posted to our subreddit. Donald Trump, as an example, is now considering jumping into a $15 billion French bailout of Iran if Iran is willing to come back into the Iran nuclear deal, be back in compliance with the Iran nuclear deal. There are people so out of touch with reality that they see this as Donald Trump being the big, strong negotiator. But this is maybe the most ignorantly myopic view of international relations, and specifically of the Iran deal, than I can imagine. Remember, Donald Trump bailed out of the Iran nuclear deal, even though Iran had been in compliance ever since the deal was signed. It was an international embarrassment for the United States to just not stick to our agreements without anyone else having violated them. Why would we not stick to our side of the deal? The other countries, including France, had to try at the G7 to salvage what was potentially left. And one of the things that they said was, okay, if the U.S. is out, we get that it's logical that you might try to start researching nuclear technology and developing it, and it could potentially be used for weapons. What can we do to keep you in compliance? And one of the things they came up with was a $15 billion French bailout, which now Donald Trump is considering participating in because he wants Iran to be compliant with the nuclear deal. This is only a conversation. This is only on the table because Trump bailed on the nuke deal to begin with for no reason whatsoever. Just getting his ass kicked, getting it kicked internationally. Another obvious example is North Korea. We're going to talk more about North Korea later on in today's program. Trump is so desperate to be liked and so overconfident in his negotiating skills that he doesn't even realize that there's this long history of North Korean leaders manipulating the United States or trying to manipulate the United States. And Trump goes and meets with Kim Jong Un, no preconditions, plenty of pompous bluster, comes out thinking that he negotiated some incredible deal that no one else has been able to do, even though it was the same promises that the Kim family has been making for decades, claims victory, and then, of course, nothing happens. And meanwhile, North Korea, nuclear and weapons development just keeps going on, ballistics missile tests, Trump getting his ass kicked internationally again. One more example. I think you're getting the sort of gist of it. The Chinese trade war. Trump thinks, I'll throw some tariffs at China. They'll buckle down. The U.S. will win, however he defines that. Never mind that he doesn't even understand how tariffs work. He doesn't understand how the U.S.-China relationship works. And China instead says, okay, you're putting tariffs on us. We'll put tariffs on you. We'll get our aluminum and our steel elsewhere. We'll make a deal with Russia for energy development and exploration. We'll get our soy elsewhere. And Trump gets his ass kicked again, crushing farmers, crushing related industries. And the world is just wondering, what is this guy doing? Why is he doing this? Could we maybe not have a president getting his ass kicked weekly? And I've been very careful when I make a comparison between Trump and George W. Bush. I don't want to do it in any way that suggests George W. Bush was anything other than a neoconservative maniac with terrible policies. Bush didn't get his ass kicked in this way internationally week in and week out. Bush made terrible policy decisions. I disagreed with his moral framework based on born-again Christianity or whatever it was that he most recently ascribed to. He was a warmonger. Economically, I didn't agree with the guy, but he wasn't getting his ass kicked in the boneheaded way that Donald Trump is week in and week out. Our historical allies are looking around wondering, what's wrong with this guy? It's not just that they disagree with the decisions or the underlying policy to the extent Trump has an underlying political philosophy. They just can't understand why he keeps doing the most boneheaded things to his own disadvantage, and it's reflecting extremely poorly on the United States. The world, Trump may have high approval among red state Republicans 55 plus. I'm sure among that group, his approval rating is off the chart, but the world is wondering, how could Americans be so dumb? And this is the way they're thinking about us now. How could they be so dumb as to have voted this guy in the first place? We need to change that in November of next year, and I hope that we will. Hey, this is pretty funny. Not only does British Prime Minister Boris Johnson look like Donald Trump, he's also triggered just as easily by people who disagree with him. We're very quickly learning. We've been covering the atrocious idea that is Brexit since the vote back in June 23rd of 2016, I believe it was. And whether Brexit will or won't ultimately happen, we still don't know, although it's not looking particularly good. But in any case, one of the most recent sort of milestones or events in the Brexit saga was the abandonment of the prime ministership by Theresa May and her replacement by the pro-Brexit conservative Boris Johnson, who looks a lot like Trump and we're learning is Trumpian in some other ways. And things have not been going particularly well for Boris Johnson. Between abandonment of the Tory party by one MP, combined with a number of others just not agreeing with Boris Johnson's path forward on Brexit, he is managing a Brexit that is once again very much imperiled and increasingly unpopular. Yesterday, Boris Johnson was in Luxembourg, and he was scheduled to do a press conference with the Prime Minister of Luxembourg. And this is amazing. They come out of this meeting, and there are two lecterns and two microphones set up for them. And there's a lot of protesters that have gathered in Luxembourg. And the Prime Minister of Luxembourg ends up just walking Boris Johnson straight out. Boris Johnson just completely bails on this press conference they had scheduled. And then around comes the Luxembourg Prime Minister and actually does a little bit of a press conference by himself. Check this out. We're going to have video here of Johnson walking out with the Luxembourg Prime Minister and just walking right on by the lectern and straight out as a result of the protesters. And then the Prime Minister of Luxembourg comes back around and actually talks to the press.
Show, this is live pictures as Boris Johnson leaves the Luxembourg Prime Minister's residence. Let's just listen in. Well, you can hear the noise that awaited his departure, and that has led to the cancellation of the news conference that was scheduled for 2:15 this afternoon. As the camera swings around, you'll see to the left there the podium where the two prime ministers would have held that news conference, but because of the noise and the booing and the use of a megaphone, chants from many British expats among them, we're told, with banners protesting Boris's Brexit vote. In fact, I think we may well hear from the Luxembourg Prime Minister right now. So let's just listen in. This is Xavier Bettel. Let's hear from him if we can.
Thank you very much for listening to me. I think demonstrating is a right in a democracy, and it is important also to be able to exchange and to listen to each other.
This is just amazing. First of all, how funny is it that Xavier Bettel, the Luxembourg Prime Minister, walks out with Boris Johnson? Like, clearly Boris Johnson is fine. They had their meeting. They walk right by where the press conference was supposed to be taking place, walks him right out, and then goes over to the lectern, and immediately people quiet right down, and he's able to talk with no problem whatsoever. And the hilarious explanation from Boris Johnson's team was that it was just too loud and rambunctious because of those protesters. Rambunctious being my word, not theirs, admittedly, and that it would just be really hard for anybody to hear him if he participated in this press conference. And yet, it seems like it was fine, and he would obviously have been given the opportunity to speak. What a brave guy, right? Trump wouldn't go to Britain unless Britain could guarantee that protests would be quashed and Trump wouldn't have to be driving around met by protesters. And then you've got Trumpian British Prime Minister Boris Johnson going to Luxembourg and just straight up walking away from the press conference without participating. And there's a very interesting parallel sort of developing between Trump and Johnson, other than, as I've said, they have a very similar look physically. They're both triggered by protesters very easily. They both are increasingly not respected by other world leaders. Almost every world leader other than, I guess, some of the authoritarian types, I guess, like Trump, or I don't know if respect Trump is the right word, but most world leaders don't respect the current president of the United States. Fellow European Union leaders increasingly don't respect Boris Johnson and his harebrained ideas. So what hopefully this represents, we may be starting to see the pendulum sort of swing back against the nationalist authoritarian ideas that have been sort of successfully masquerading as populism. Over the last 4 to 5 years, it's become trendy in some circles. Hopefully, we're starting to see the pendulum swing back the other way. One other similarity I'm seeing between Trump and Boris Johnson is that the United Kingdom is increasingly seen as a laughingstock internationally as a result of the endless Brexit fiasco, much like the United States under Donald Trump is also seen as a complete and total laughingstock. It's actually quite remarkable, the similarities that have developed between the United States and the UK over the last couple of years. We'll continue to follow Brexit. We'll continue to follow Boris Johnson and the ways in which he is increasingly similar to the president of the United States. Let me know what you think about him just bailing, walking right by the lectern, and going on out and back to Britain. I'm on Twitter at @dpakman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show. And make sure that you are following me on Twitch at twitch.tv/David Pakman. If you have an Amazon Prime membership already, at no extra cost, you can subscribe to our Twitch channel with something called Twitch Prime. Amazon Prime confers 1 free Twitch Prime membership per month. Costs you nothing, but it counts as a paid membership for us. It's like free money that you can give us at twitch.tv/David Pakman.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new members of the day are Florian Buntz and Glenn Collins. Florian and Glenn, really appreciate your support. Membership is the primary funding source for our show. You can sign up in under a minute at joinpakman.com. Today's longtime sustaining member of the day is Dale Brooks. Dale's been with us for almost 5 years. Every year you stay a member, we get even stronger, much to the dismay of those who are waiting for the show to fail. And there are many of them, unfortunately. Join these great folks by signing up at joinpakman.com. We do have a 40% off coupon code available but not mandatory. That code is THISIS2020, and it'll save you 40% off of the membership of your choice. So Donald Trump's taxes are back in the news and have actually been subpoenaed by the Manhattan District Attorney. State prosecutors in Manhattan have subpoenaed Donald Trump's accounting firm, demanding 8 years of both Trump's personal and business tax returns. Now, the first question we might ask is, District Attorney, if a district attorney is issuing a subpoena for Donald Trump's tax returns, Is this related to some kind of investigation? And the answer is that yes. It turns out that at the end of August, a criminal investigation was opened up into those hush money payments made by Donald Trump to mistresses. And I know many of us are completely fatigued and sick of this hush money thing by now. And I'll sort of address that in a second. These are the payments that were made. The payments were made in a literal sense by Trump's now in prison personal attorney, Michael Cohen. But of course, they were made in service to Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, as far as we know, reimbursed those payments to Michael Cohen. So that's the answer to question one. It's part of that a new criminal investigation. Question two is, what's the full scope of this Manhattan District Attorney probe? Is it related only to the 2016 hush money payments, or is there some broader campaign finance or other investigation that this is part of? We don't know the answer to that. We know that one legal question about the hush money, particularly the payment made to Stormy Daniels, is, did Donald Trump's business call that a legal expense in their accounting, which would be, number one, hilarious, and number two, potentially illegal and a felony if it was done to conceal some other crime like tax evasion or bank fraud or in the service of some additional crime. So we'll figure that out maybe someday. But let's get more to what matters here and what doesn't matter. I understand we are mostly sick of this entire hush money payment thing. The hush money payments themselves as a way to punish Donald Trump or make him suffer consequences for the things that he did, I believe that that ship has sailed. We can, as a practical matter, vote Donald Trump out way faster than the hush money payment investigation could even potentially remove him from office. It's just not going to happen. We shouldn't even be thinking about that. Then we get to the content of the tax returns themselves. That's actually what we're interested in. Now, that being said, this is a district attorney subpoena for an investigation. If they get the tax returns, meaning if the grand jury gets those tax returns, they would not even go public unless they're leaked, of course, unless they end up becoming evidence at a trial. That is also extremely unlikely to happen. So I don't really see this as something to be optimistic about in terms of the material getting to us for our review. But it's yet another thing that could trigger Donald Trump, first of all. Secondly, every time that we do hear anything related to the content of Donald Trump's taxes, it's been something that makes him look terrible. So there is still the potential here that if any of this is released in any way, leaked or otherwise, it's going to contain extremely damaging information about Donald Trump. Remember that when the summaries of Donald Trump's tax returns got out, we learned that he lost just like insane amounts of money. And they put out, his attorney or someone put out a statement saying, oh, this is all calculated. He's gaming the system and this is all because he's such a great businessman. People who were not working for Trump, who know about tax law and accounting, looked at it and said, no, this is just the guy's really losing a lot of money, or he lost a lot of money in that time. It would not be for the tax benefits. We also learned from other tax disclosures of Trump that we got a while ago that Donald Trump's dad had financed a lot of Donald Trump's failures. We call that rich dad bails me out, just like the height of privilege for someone claiming to be a self-made man. So this could be interesting if something like that comes out. It could be interesting in that even just fighting it could become a big story and expensive for Donald Trump, which would be just delightful. But as far as getting rid of Trump, as far as exposing criminality, the strategy remains the same one that it's been for more than a year. Vote Trump out in November of 2020. He'll be gone when a new president is inaugurated in January of 2021, and it will be far, far more efficient than any of these ideas related to tax returns or the 25th Amendment or impeachment. I know the fans of each of those individually will say, no, those are great ideas, David, and they may well be, but they're not going to get Trump out any faster than just voting him out in November. If you disagree with me, let me know. Donald Trump is trying to go after the Hispanic vote increasingly. We know that he has said he loves his African Americans, as he has pointed to people in the crowd. By the way, the guy he referred to as my African American, he, I guess, is no longer a Republican, so that didn't go super well. And Donald Trump now trying to appeal to Hispanic and Latino voters. Trump did a campaign rally yesterday in New Mexico. The idea was, let's show up there and let's talk about how low Hispanic unemployment is and how great everything is. And it went about as poorly as you would expect. First of all, bad poll after bad poll for Donald Trump in some key swing states for 2020. 8 years of tax returns subpoenaed, as I already told you about. New corruption investigation into Trump's transportation secretary, who happens to be Mitch McConnell's wife, Elaine Chao. So Trump, in the midst of all this, shows up in New Mexico and tries to appeal to Hispanic voters, sort of in the same way that he tried to appeal to black voters in 2016, which is blaming other people for things and citing incorrect statistics. The clips are genuinely hard to watch, but also kind of fun. Listen to Trump here as he talks about the Hispanics, as he refers to them.
I saw where the Hispanic American, the Hispanics, were up with me in a poll, 17%. And everyone said, how is that? How is that? How is that? 17%. Up by 70%. I won't even tell you what the final number was because they won't believe it. But you're going to see what the final number. But you know why? Because the Hispanic Americans, they understand they don't want criminals coming across the border. They don't want people taking their jobs. They want to have that security, and they want the wall. They want the wall.
Taking their jobs. It's truly hilarious that they still use that stupid, debunked, bogus talking point meant to completely exculpate big corporations from the immigration low-wage status quo that persists here in the United States. And more importantly, the bigger lie there, Donald Trump claiming that Hispanics want the border wall. It's like, no, they don't. Most of the country doesn't want the border wall. And if you're looking specifically at Hispanic voters, we, as part of that group, we don't want the border wall. I mean, completely and totally untrue. Trump also heckled yesterday a bunch of times. I was only able, in the time I had to prep this morning, I was only able to pull one clip where you hear the heckling going on. Trump doing all the normal attempts to appeal to Hispanic voters. You'll hear him getting heckled after the initial applause line here in the background. Trump just continues talking over it and actually does successfully.
Yesterday marked the beginning of the Hispanic Heritage Month. Who's Hispanic here? Latinos for Trump. Thank you. Incredible people. But we have much to celebrate. Unbelievable when you think the unemployment for Hispanic Americans is right now at the lowest level ever recorded in the history of our country. Hispanic American poverty reached a brand new all-time low in history. And after years of stagnation that you know very well, wages for Hispanic Americans are rising really fast, up nearly 8% since my election. Those are unheard of numbers. They're unheard of. And median income, think of that, median income for Hispanic Americans surpassed $50,000 for the first time ever.
So this is the same type of pandering that we've seen from Donald Trump before. Yes, the polls don't look good among Hispanics for Donald Trump or in these swing states, but the only poll that matters in the end is how people actually go and vote in November of 2020, if they actually choose to vote. So despite all this pandering, despite all this rambling and all of it, that man that you just saw talking about Hispanics and lying about the wall, he can still win in 2020 on autopilot if we do not show up. How a Hispanic voter, speaking as a Hispanic voter myself, can support Donald Trump at this point, I don't know. And the rallies make it even more confusing, patronizing marginalized and minority communities in the most obviously transparent ways. The supporters are totally cringeworthy. It's an international embarrassment, and it actually, in the end, may all work to get the guy reelected. That's just the sole focus needs to be, no matter how cartoonish the clips I play for you, no matter how unbelievable and erratic and bogus are the claims that Donald Trump makes, he can get reelected in 2020, and he can do it even if his approval rating drops 10 points, mathematically, that is. And so in the end, all that matters is that we actually go and vote in November of 2020 and get as many people as possible to go and do the same thing. Make sure you're following The David Pakman Show on Instagram at David Pakman Show. And while you are there, follow me on Instagram at david.pakman. We'll take a quick break and back with Oliver Thorn from Philosophy Tube right after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to welcome to the program today Oliver Thorn, who's a professional actor and also the creator of Philosophy Tube, a YouTube channel with about 500,000 subscribers teaching philosophy in fun, interesting, and I would say well-produced ways. Is that fair to say?
Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, I mean, for people not familiar with you, to talk a little bit about the philosophy piece of it, I mean, how long have you been studying philosophy and sort of like what's your relationship generally to philosophy?
It was my first degree, and I started the show in my second year of university. I just wanted to give away my degree for free online. That was 6 years ago, and since then it's become like a phenomenon, I guess.
One of the things I like about what you do is that there's a movement, at least in the United States, where the right will often successfully convert people to their side by talking exclusively about principles. And I've long said that it's great to understand what our principles are and to be introspective and so on and so forth, but that a lot of the dirty work or the work happens in actually figuring out how to apply those principles to real world problems and very quickly realizing that oftentimes those principles conflict. One thing I think you do well, and I'm curious to hear whether this is deliberate or one of the primary things you're trying to do, is integrate the discussions of principles from the get-go into how they relate to real world problems and not have this separation of all that matters is the principles, which sometimes happens with philosophical discussions.
Yeah, definitely. I always try to make the philosophy relevant to everyday life. I mean, that's half the fun, and that's half of what I try and do is say, no, this isn't just some sort of ivory tower academic like BH strokey thing. Like philosophy isn't relevant to people's lives. Like I think if that's the way you're doing philosophy, then I think arguably you're doing it wrong. The whole point is that it's sometimes life and death, and it's vitally interesting and is so interesting and important if you give it a chance. So yes, I absolutely try and do that deliberately.
Are you trying to reorient people's values or perspectives? Is that, or how would you describe like the goals of what you are doing? Is it education? Do you consider that it goes beyond that into advocacy?
I think it's definitely educational. I also try and take a bit of a new approach to education. I find that certainly they're not exclusively on the right. Often when people talk about philosophy and principles in education, it's very competitive. It's like you need this so you can win, or you need this to be like aggressive. The analogy that I use is like, imagine if people only went to the gym because they were training to be street fighters. It's like, it's just kind of a weird way of doing it. Whereas what I try and do is create an environment where it's not competitive. It's not about like poning the libs or like winning the debate. It's about curiosity, not ambition, is the mantra that I try and use. So yes, it's educational, but also I've got a kind of meta educational attitude towards it, which I try and bring across in my work as well.
Have you heard anecdotally about people whose worldview or at least their views on particular issues have been drastically altered by consuming your content?
Yeah, big time. I get emails almost every day from people who say that, which is amazing.
And what's the gist of it in the sense of, I mean, I guess I have many questions about this. Feel free to pick any of these that you want to address first. I mean, are you seeing, what is the ideological change that seems to most commonly be taking place? What is it specifically that people say it was that changed their minds?
I get a lot of emails from people who say that they used to be alt-right and then they found my work and they move across. I get a lot of emails from people saying that they are still like don't quite agree with everything I say, but they're starting to move across. After my video on abortion, actually, I got a lot of people who are pro-life who said that I changed their mind, which was interesting. And I actually get a lot of emails in particular from men who are like looking for a new way of being masculine or approach to being intellectual that isn't necessarily competitive, who say that they really value that kind of environment that I create. So it's quite diverse, but it's quite diverse, but I do get a lot of I do get a lot of people writing to me saying that I've sort of changed their outlook on things, sometimes in subtle ways and sometimes very drastic ways, which is always lovely.
Can you talk a little bit about that, what you hear from men? So I think you said that was interesting, that people get from you, they get a different way of being, was it a different way of being masculine? And can you just remind me again how you said that? That was interesting.
Yeah, I do get a lot of emails from guys and people of all genders, but especially guys who say that they're kind of looking for a way to be masculine that isn't necessarily competitive or aggressive, and that they find that the environment I create sort of helps them do that. A way to be intellectual, again, that isn't about like winning the debate or like training for the fight, but is just about sort of exploring it for their own sake and having a curious attitude.
One of the things I've expressed kind of concern about is, okay, so at the 30,000 foot level, or 10,000 meter level, for lack of a better term, we have talked about these algorithms that will often create self-perpetuating feedback loops where people are sort of pushed further and further into more and more extreme content. I believe it happens more on the right, but it could conceivably happen on both sides of the political spectrum, and we could kind of have that conversation. And then I will also hear from people much like you who say that my content was at some point in their deprogramming phase, something that the algorithm suggested and got them out of whatever ideology they had initially been pulled into. And one of the things I've said is, on an objective level, I think that this is good in that I think the alt-right is a bad set of ideas. And if someone gets pulled out of that and they come over to my side, that's good. At the same time, I have the concern that there is a level of malleability to people's values and politics, whereby by clicking around on YouTube, they can get so pulled to one side, and then by mere chance, algorithmic chance, they get dragged all the way back to the other side. Even if I agree with the outcome, I'm still concerned that there is that level of malleability. Do you share that concern? And what's your sort of thought about that?
I see where you're coming from. I understand the worry, especially that it seems to be governed by kind of big technological unseen forces like the algorithm. But at the same time, I think that's absolutely wonderful that people can learn and change their minds, and that people remain curious, and that all it takes is like a little knock on a door you hadn't realized was there, and you can open it and be like, oh my God, I was wrong the whole time. And that's one of the feelings that I love, is when you go, oh my gosh, I was completely wrong about this. And now I have an opportunity to learn something wonderful and new and something I'd never considered about. The emails I love the most I get from people when people say, I never thought about it that way, or I never thought about it at all. And that's wonderful, because then like a whole new wing opens up in your mind. And so I get the concern,
I understand that, but I guess
it's kind of beautiful.
That is certainly a very charitable way to describe it, and I think in a lot of cases that it does apply, and it simply is that way, and there isn't more to it. I guess what I'm thinking of is, if I think of myself now and 10 years ago, and when I was in high school or whatever, I want to believe that I was never in a place where, by clicking around on YouTube, if I had seen Ben Shapiro and then Stefan Molyneux and then whatever, that I would have said, oh, you know what? I never thought about this way. I'm now an extreme alt-right nationalist, whatever, right? Like if that had been possible, I think it would have said something not particularly positive about me, that I was so ungrounded in my beliefs that they could have so drastically been changed. I guess that's my concern.
Well, I mean, I almost went down that path myself a few years ago. I went through a phase of I went like a Hitchens, Dawkins atheist phase that was gradually getting more and more radically right wing. Yeah. But also, I mean, 10 years ago I was what, 16? So I mean, who really is that firmly grounded in their beliefs at 16, or indeed at any age, that they can't be persuaded? I mean, I understand the desire to think, oh God, you know, I don't like the idea that I could have gone down that road. But at the same time, there's something quite. I think maybe that speaks to that competitive mindset that actually, I don't want to think of myself that I could ever be persuaded by that. But I mean, it could happen to all of us.
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess it's a matter of degree, right? There's no and I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting that we should all be completely insulated from the idea of re-examining our beliefs or considering some of our conclusions may have been off. But, you know, I guess I'm reminded of there's this cultural critic and arbiter of ideas named Dave Rubin, who you may be familiar with, who at nearly 40 years old had almost 180-degree sort of political realignment or awakening. And while he insists a lot of his positions haven't changed, like, for example, he's for gay marriage, There's something about that if we believe it to be genuine, and not everybody does, at that age, to exist in a way that you could so radically be, quote, awakened, something about it I find concerning, even without disagreeing with you, that being open to new ideas and re-examining beliefs is, of course, something we should encourage.
I mean, I agree, and I also I see where you're coming from in saying that it's concerning. I think it's both concerning and kind of beautiful at the same time.
Can you talk a little bit, not to go completely off in that rabbit hole, can you talk a little bit about, is there a political philosophy that is implicit in most of the sort of status quo political conversations that are happening today about neoliberalism and social democracy? Or, if we look at like the most prevalent political debates today, is there a philosophical underpinning that you believe exists there, but which most people have not actually studied in detail, which would be particularly useful to understand the political debates that we're having?
I think certainly a lot of the discussions I have with people that revolve around political philosophy, people tend to come at it from a liberal, capital L, liberal point of view. And I understand that in the US, people sometimes use the word liberal differently. So in the UK, I would say that both the major political parties in your country are capital L liberal, yes, even though one of them is more conservative. So I think often people come at it from that perspective. And it's sometimes, I was raised with that perspective. So it's kind of sometimes difficult to get out from under it. I find it very interesting and very rewarding and kind of fun to make people aware of that perspective. I did a series a while ago, it was quite a few years ago now, called What Was Liberalism, which a lot of people have written to me saying, I never thought about it like that, which is quite interesting, almost like trying to step outside of it and look in. So I guess people learning a little bit of like what liberalism is and where it comes from and how it's not sort of built into the fabric of the universe, but in fact, you can get curious about it and change if you want to. I find that to be a particularly rewarding aspect of what I do sometimes.
What do you think is a specific alternative to that type of status quo liberalism, using the word in the sense that you're talking about, that is most interesting to point people to if they're looking to explore alternatives?
I try not to point people towards a specific tendency or anything, but like one alternative to liberalism would be fascism, and another would I guess be leftism. So I would say that I'm a leftist, and I deliberately in public don't get any more specific than that. But certainly I find that a lot of people reflexively defend capitalism without really having necessarily thought about it or everything that comes along with it. And sometimes it's fun to kind of pull on that thread and think, okay, where did you get this idea from? And I describe it as like dislodging an idea inside your head and saying, where did I get this and how does it work and do I want to keep it or not? And sometimes people go, yes, actually I do, now that I understand it, I do want to hang on to this, and that's fine. And sometimes people go, actually, you know what, this is kind of weird, and what else have you got?
There's a couple things that you do that I'm curious about, whether you do them for a particular strategic reason or they are merely the way you like to do things, or whatever the case may be. One is that your videos are produced in a way that includes, I'm thinking that they include scripts and sort of some pretty specific thought as to what is said and when, sometimes costumes and imagery and things that sort of go around the edges of the ideas. Is that something you do merely because you enjoy it? Is there some strategy behind it? I mean, speculating the idea that maybe it helps appeal to people that might be, I don't know, center-right gamers that might get pulled in by the algorithm, or whatever the case may be. I mean, how much of that is merely what you like to do versus a strategic decision?
I mean, it's both. So, but perhaps for your viewers who haven't seen any of my videos, I should say I will sometimes include, I use a lot of visual metaphor. I use a lot of costumes and characters and narrative devices. In my video about abortion, which we mentioned earlier, it was spliced in with a short film that I made. And I do all of that, again, both partly because I love it, because in my other life I am a professional actor, and I love theatre and film and the use of visual metaphor and telling a story that way. But it also does help. It does help draw people in. People get excited about it. People like it. It's very different. It's something that not a lot of people can do. You know, when I started out on YouTube, nobody was summarizing Plato, but now you throw a stone in the woods and you'll hit 50 YouTubers summarizing Plato, right? So incorporating all that stuff is kind of like something that only I can do, and sort of brings my unique creative twist to it, which I love. And it does help people learn in different ways, because there's more than one way of skinning the cat. Sometimes people will say, I don't really get what you mean by Timothy Morton's concept of the hyper object of climate change. And I say, well, it's in front of you, because that's the costume I'm wearing is like a visual representation of his whole book on this philosophy. So maybe if people find it hard to engage one way, the quote theatrical stuff can help do it the other way. Like I did a video a while ago on the philosophy of mind and trauma, and it's all one uncut half-hour monologue. There's no cuts to it. And that's not an accident. That's not just I'm rambling. It's very tightly scripted. It's because that is actually designed to tell you something about what it's like to learn about trauma and to learn about these ideas. So I do it because I love it, and because it works, and because it's just, it's so much fun and it helps people learn.
Is there a particular philosophical thought line that you think is most acutely missing from the sort of brains of people that are discussing politics and culture and the way that societies should be organized, where if it was more known to people, we would all be far better off? So like I often talk about how there's such a lack of critical thinking and sort of learning how to learn and understanding how propaganda works, and that's like a set of knowledge that would be very useful in general for a lot of the conversations we're trying to have. When it comes to philosophy, is there something in particular that you believe if more people studied and were acquainted with, we would be much better positioned to figure out many of the problems that modern societies deal with?
I definitely agree with you about propaganda, and that it's useful to learn how that works. I guess something that I have struggled to find a way to teach is not even an idea or a set of ideas, but more like a set of skills that studying philosophy formally brought me, which is like how to read and break down an argument. So sometimes I will get comments under my videos where people say, well, what about this thing? This one tiny thing that you've said invalidates everything else. And I go, well, no, because that's actually not really relevant. That was a side comment, or that was an aside, or that's not, or actually if you take that out, the rest of it still works. So there's something about argumentative structure and like logical structure that I think picked up. It's not even a language, like almost a grammar of philosophical arguments, which I have struggled to find a way to teach on its own. And then I'm just always kind of thinking about which I think would maybe be useful. It's not even like reading comprehension. It's something even more basic than that, like logical comprehension. Like something being entailed by something else, and like how arguments fit together, I think would be really, I would find it very useful. But then perhaps that's just me not knowing how to effectively communicate with people who haven't had that study.
Yeah, I mean, it is a skill in and of itself how to teach people how to teach themselves, so to speak, or to teach people how to learn. And I 100% agree. I mean, both in my academic experience and my media experience, it just seems acutely missing from a lot of the conversations that we're having about so many of the most important issues of the day. We've been speaking with Oliver Thorn, who is not only a professional actor, but also the creator of Philosophy Tube on YouTube. Oliver, so great to speak to you. I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
There's a really strange story about how Donald Trump will just not stop talking about North Korean dictator Kim Jong Un to other world leaders, and the other world leaders are getting really weirded out by what Donald Trump is doing. You know how sometimes a 4-year-old will be obsessed with telling the same story over and over again to anyone they talk to? My blue Legos disappeared and I made a green castle and mommy gave me a cookie. Oh, that's great. That's great. Yeah. And just telling the same story over and over again. Trump has become the sort of adult, I'm not going to call it the adult version of that, but sort of the adult version of that. Trump reportedly going into the same weird monologue about how wonderful dictator Kim Jong Un is to any world leader that will listen. And we had the G7 last month, where according to 3 sources, there was a meeting with the world leaders, understandably, as there were, of course, many meetings. And the topic of North Korea actually came up during this meeting. And the context was, hey, North Korea has been firing short-range ballistic missiles into the Sea of Japan. And Trump interjects this tangential, wacky story about just how great Kim Jong Un is and how great Trump's relationship with Kim Jong Un is. He rambled for 10 minutes, reportedly, and the room of world leaders was invisibly stunned silence, according to 3 people that were in the room. Funny how often that happens, because yesterday we learned that at the G7, Trump walked into a meeting set to be with the Egyptian president and yelled, "Where's my favorite dictator?" also putting the room into this stunned silence. And here it is this time talking just so positively about another dictator, Kim Jong Un. Now, here is where it gets even weirder. Donald Trump has told this exact same story verbatim before. In Canada last year, Trump told this exact same story to the same group of world leaders minus Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson wasn't the British Prime Minister at the time, so it was a marginally different group. And it's this story about how, the little Rocket Man stuff got Kim Jong Un all wound up. And he mentions Elton John when he tells the story. I mean, it sounds like it would be a Saturday Night Live parody of what Trump says to world leaders, but it's a literal speech that Donald Trump has now been telling world leaders for multiple years. And the world leaders that see Trump up close are understandably horrified by his behavior. And that's terrible if you care about the image of the United States around the world. You don't have to be, a hyper-nationalist to just care if the country you live in is perceived as being headed up by a clueless clown. And no offense to clowns, of course, but it's a totally respectable job. But it is something that you can care about merely because you care about the image of the country you live in. Now, there's a silver lining here. Trump really likes Kim Jong Un, and he's not just saying it. In other words, Trump lies so often that when we get what seems to be corroboration about something Donald Trump thinks, in this case that he likes Kim Jong Un, there's this tiny silver lining in that we found out Trump actually told the truth about something. The trend is that when Trump is being honest, he often is saying that he likes a dictator. One of the things Donald Trump in his presidency has been most honest about, one area where we can believe him, is when he's talking about a dictator or an authoritarian strongman in glowing terms. That seems to actually be just honest Donald Trump. And the problem, of course, is that he's so easy to manipulate. North Korea's Kim family has been trying to control American presidents for decades, but normally the American presidents and the people around them have the diplomatic sense not to allow these propaganda meetings with no preconditions, because they know they're only good for North Korea. They're only good for the propaganda that North Korea will then generate from these meetings, and we get nothing. And much like Trump's been played by the Russians before, he's getting played by Kim Jong Un, and it's working to such a degree that in private, he's just glowing about just how terrific Kim Jong Un is. Now, on Friday, we are going to deal with the question, when should a president meet versus not meet or negotiate with different people? It's an important topic, and it relates to Trump and North Korea. We can't just criticize Trump. We need to lay out a framework for when does dialogue make sense and when is dialogue, or at least dialogue without preconditions, not the right thing. I will deal with that on the Friday show in audience questions. I have some actual good news related to the Women's March, which has unfortunately become very toxic and counterproductive as a movement over the last year or so. The Women's March is replacing 3 inaugural board members and co-founders who I've talked about before. 3 people who have been dogged by endless problems of marginalizing people who aren't the right type of intersectional, allegations of anti-Semitism, marginalization of Jewish women who want to be part of the movement. And I'm talking, of course, about Bob Bland, Tamika Mallory, and Linda Sarsour. Sarsour, of course, is now a Bernie Sanders surrogate. I told you that about a week or 2 ago, something that Bernie should be 110% disassociating himself from. Maybe this will push him to do that. There will be a new set of 16 board members coming in, including 3 Jewish women and a trans woman and a whole bunch of other people. Now, to be totally honest, this strikes me as too little too late. The Women's March name at this point is quite tarnished. The relationships with historically allied communities like the Jewish community, one of the forefront civil rights advocate communities in the United States historically, it may be irreparably frayed. I'm not saying I want it to be. I'm saying it may be. I'm glad that Mallory, Bland, and Sarsour are going bye-bye. But I'm just wondering out loud, not in a rhetorical sense, but I'm just wondering, is this an organization that is going to have a role in the 2020 election? Because you have a progressive movement that's more engaged than ever. You have new coalitions of all kinds that includes a very varied list of groups that are ready to go and working on the ground. The Women's March has been dogged by these people. It's become extremely divisive. And to be honest, this is also, it's almost like too friendly a way of cutting ties with absolutely toxic people. The 3 board members have stepped down. It's unclear whether they were forced or not. It seems a little bit soft. The statement that was put out by the Women's March is completely gushing about the groundbreaking work and sacrifices towards equal rights, unless, of course, you don't fit the right version of intersectionality, in which case you're marginalized. And it's also unclear how much the people that remain or are replacing them are fans of, for example, Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam milieu, with which Sarsour and Mallory, at least, and I'm not sure about Bob Bland, were affiliated with. I just don't know. And I don't want to belittle people when they make the right decision. The right decision is that these 3 have no business being part of a group that claims to be about inclusivity and egalitarianism and all of that. No question about it. At the same time, it's hard to see this and have sort of a renewed enthusiasm for an organization whose rallies have become sort of secondary to the internal conflicts and the discrediting of potential and actual constituent activists. And it is sad because it started with at least ideas that are really good ideas that I'm behind. The upside is that I do see the momentum of the progressive movement having legs in 2020 that go way beyond the Women's March, and that's a great thing. The Women's March at this point is not going to be central to what happens in 2020. It's all of the other progressive activism, which is so widespread at this point in time, and that's a good thing. We don't want a prominent organization to progressive activism that functions as a sort of gatekeeper that says, well, Jewish women, they're not really intersectional in the way that we want. And now the question is, will Bernie Sanders disavow Linda Sarsour as a surrogate, a totally divisive character? She shouldn't be involved with a good progressive campaign like the one that Bernie is running. And by the way, I expected wholly negative reactions to my segment last week or the week before saying Linda Sarsour should not be a Bernie surrogate. There was a little bit of that toxic left that didn't like it, but overwhelmingly positive response to that. And that may have been an area I would have previously self-censored on. So that's great. The voicemail number for the show is 219-2-DAVID-P. Here's another song submitted to the David Pakman Show. Take a listen to this one.
Hello, David. Well, hello, David. It's so nice to have you back on your YouTube show. You're looking swell, David. I can tell. David, you're still glowing. You're still going. You're still looking strong.
Yes, very good. Thank you. I don't know if that is supposed to be made also into a dubstep EDM remix, but at this point, the questions around whether these are satirical songs or not are only growing. And thank you for the submission. I appreciate it. Is this the best singer from our audience so far that has submitted a song? That is my question to you. We've got a great bonus show for you today. 450,000 people applied for Andrew Yang's $1,000 a month offer that he announced at the presidential debate last week. We will also talk more about Donald Trump looking to turn New Mexico red, and Arizona's Supreme Court has greenlit discrimination against same-sex weddings. All of those stories and more on today's bonus show. I implore you to join me there by becoming a member at joinpakman.com or a patron at patreon.com/DavidPakmanShow.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.